Path of Exile 2 is the latest ARPG to be released in the genre, and as someone who has always been interested in the genre but never played a game from this genre for any sufficient length of time to have a purposeful opinion, the more footage I saw of the game, the more I was inclined to just give it a try. It looked both interesting with all the loot in different areas you'll come across in your travels, but also engaging because of how much there is to do whilst you're just running around, slaying monsters, collecting loot, and leveling up. The 30-second gameplay loop of PoE 2 is both simple in presentation, but complex in execution. There's a lot more going on than what you see in footage, and while there can be moments that allow you to kind of turn your brain off and just take aim at whatever's in front of you, there's also moments where if you're not paying attention and locked in, you'll die again and again. And to me, that's one of the elements that makes PoE 2 so compelling. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. This video will be my thoughts about the game from the perspective of someone who has basically never played an ARPG to endgame. I have a little experience, but not enough to those who have been enjoying this genre for potentially decades. I have played a handful of other ARPGs before, so I figured I should actually explain my history with some of these games to give you a little bit of perspective. But again, I haven't spent enough time to have a real opinion on any of these games, to be fair. Diablo 4, I put maybe 15 to 20 hours into it, but at some point the game kinda just lost me because I felt as though, given the information that I had, my damage was really falling off and I just wasn't able to survive. I was probably just doing stuff wrong, and while I did enjoy the game and its mechanics, the mid-game kinda just lost me, sadly. I barely touched Path of Exile 1, maybe less than 10 hours into it. What really was tough to grasp was the lack of interesting starting classes, at least for me personally. Diablo was also the same way, but for me, I can't lie, I'm kind of a basic bitch, to put it bluntly. Just give me a class with cool plate armor and some kind of sword, either a one- or two-handed sword, and I'm very happy. But PoE 1 didn't have that, at least from what I remember, so it was tough to devote time to something that didn't grab me right off the bat. And even though this isn't technically an ARPG, Throne and Liberty feels similar enough to at least mention, even though it's an MMO, being the game out of this bunch that I've put the most time into so far, which was about almost 30 to 40 hours. The character customization was what I was most impressed with. It was really awesome to be able to craft a character that looked really cool and to my exact detail. Best part was, one of the starting weapons was a typical greatsword, which is exactly what I wanted. These two things alone got me to invest time into the game, but sadly, again, the mid-game was where it kind of lost me. The lack of item variety and having used only 3 different swords throughout my entire travels had me kind of asking where the loot was. But because it's free to play, you can guess where some of that variety was hiding. Either way, the point of this info dump was to simply say that I have experienced these games, but haven't really played them. They tend to lose me after some points, and I never reached the end game. I've never done raids or anything like that. It was always me losing interest in the game, and that's not saying the game is bad per se. However, so far, it feels like PoE 2 might be the exception to this personal rule. Path of Exile 2 feels like a cross between a traditional ARPG, but with some elements coming from the Devil May Cry series of all things. The most notable difference between this game and something like Diablo is that the roll or dodge mechanic has no cooldown. Doesn't cost any resource to use, it's just a small recovery period after the roll is finished. In D4, you had a limit to how many times you could quickly move around, and while there were items to increase the number of charges you had, eventually you would not be able to dodge anymore and would be put on a long cooldown. But in PoE 2, you can just kinda roll to your heart's content. What makes this even better is, unlike the Dark Souls styled games, you can interrupt almost every action with a roll. Swing in the wrong direction? Just press roll. Misclick or do anything else with the wrong buttons? Just roll. It's more like a traditional action game where inputs don't feel like commitments and that there is always a way to get out of a jam, which does 2 things. It increases the pace of the game naturally by allowing players to make mistakes and then immediately correcting them, and 2, it removes some of the friction points people might have when they get overwhelmed by a large group of enemies and are desperately trying to fight their way out. Neither is better than the other, but it's interesting for PoE to do this when they could have leaned into the Souls styles of long, deliberate attack animations that you need to commit to. But I'd imagine that would feel like ass if that was the case, considering the sheer number of enemies you will be fighting. The best feeling in this game right now is when you are against a horde of trash mobs that you can absolutely decimate with your weapons and abilities. You will feel so powerful when you're able to land the attack that sets off a chain reaction, killing off all the enemies on your screen in one fell swoop. And this game is challenging in some areas. It isn't a game you can always run on autopilot and turn your brain off. No, some bosses in areas require you to pay attention, learn their attacks, and dodge accordingly, which, as a Souls player is something I'm totally down for. Luckily, the main areas you will explore have plenty of enemies to fight at once. There are varying levels of enemy types in areas you'll travel to, and with it comes many different ways of approaching combat. And depending on which class you chose, obviously certain styles will be better suited towards certain encounters, but everyone has an answer to everything being thrown at you. The main gameplay loop I've kind of noticed with some of the classes is that they have this passive that'll mark enemies when they either have low HP or are almost about to be stunned. From there, you use one of your core abilities to consume that mark and deal big damage to that enemy, or set off some kind of explosive reaction that will engulf all surrounding enemies around the main target. After that, they are all widely different to the benefit of the game. Again, while I personally struggled with initially finding a character class I enjoyed, ultimately, the warrior has been the most fun so far. A mace might not be a sword, but being able to crush enemies underneath it and create tons of shockwaves that will be felt throughout an enemy horde does have a level of visceral satisfaction to it. I think the next character I will give a shot is going to be Ranger, so if you have experience with that class, be sure to let me know how it's like down in the comment section below. While the gameplay loop is exactly what you would expect and want from an ARPG, some of the elements going on behind the exploring and all the fighting you're going to end up doing did have me scratching my head a little bit. More so because I'm just simply not versed in these mechanics and get both confused and lost when reading and looking at what's in front of me. But the massive, absolutely gargantuan skill tree, while being a sight to really behold, is also extremely intimidating. Knowing that I might not specialize into something useful always has me questioning every choice I make. And while I know you can spend some gold to reset these points and try again, the sheer level of freedom in terms of what you can upgrade is almost a detriment to someone like myself. For veterans, they are probably just drooling at this screen every time they look at it, but for a novice of this genre, it's a little overwhelming to say the least. What is more frustrating than confusing is the sheer number of orbs you will use in the game. Every item or upgrade, for some reason, is an orb. I'm a little unsure as to why this is the case. I don't know if there's an in-lore reason or not, but I do feel as though leveling and upgrading your abilities could have been done with a more streamlined, less intrusive system. You'll find an orb in the world to unlock or upgrade an ability. You open the menu and choose what you'd like to turn the orb into, and then after you confirm it, the orb just sits in your inventory. I'm confused as to why the orb doesn't immediately open the ability screen and asks you to bind it to a button. This works the same for when the orbs that can augment an already selected ability with a passive. After a couple of hours of playing, a quarter of your limited inventory space on your character is going to be either orbs or single slot consumables. Brutal honesty, it kind of feels like a half-baked mechanic in its current form. I'm sure if enough people feel the same way, there might be some tweaks to smooth out the process, but there's just too many orbs, man. It's ridiculous. As I started the video with, I'm not well versed in these games. From an outsider's perspective, they look cool, they look fun to play, engaging, and have a ton of replay value to them. There's a reason people herald Diablo 2 as a magnum opus of this genre. People just want that experience again, but in the modern age. And it seems like a lot of games try, but don't succeed, especially the last two entries in the Diablo franchise. And while I had my fun during my time with 4, there were some things that bugged me about the game, but Path of Exile 2 feels different. Again, it's kind of hard to describe because I don't traditionally play these games, but, running around, killing enemies, listening to the music, taking in the scenery, it feels like Gauntlet Legends and Gauntlet Dark Legacy all over again. two personal favorites of mine from the N64 and original Xbox days. I adore those games, a prime example of wonderful couch co-op experiences that you might have with your buddies while you wait for the pizza you ordered to arrive. I know I'm kind of on a tangent here, but I have really been enjoying Path of Exile too. I was a little hesitant to fork up the $30 for early access because I knew at some point it would go free to play, but when I realized that it wasn't officially launching for maybe a while, I bit the bullet and bought it. But I'm genuinely happy I did. If you're kind of on the fence, if you're worried about some of the criticism regarding the combat being potentially too hard, don't be. You just need to be a little more active than you're probably used to if you play other ARPGs. But that just means you'll have a more engaging and rewarding experience when you do eventually, beat that boss and you're triumphant. If the price point is a little high for you, it's totally okay to wait for the full release. Again, it will be free to play eventually, and who doesn't love a game you didn't pay for that you can sink hundreds, if not thousands of hours into? Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. Let me know down in the comment section below your thoughts and experiences so far with Path of Exile 2, if you're enjoying it, what some of your criticisms are, and be sure to subscribe for more videos about one guy's adventures in two genres of games he's basically never really experienced before. I hope to see you in future ones.